Hello, I am mischievous Mark Ginocchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including Amazing Fantasy 15. So naturally, those all count.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I say count, but my opinion on that is irrelevant in the shadow of Mark's owning of Amazing Fantasy 15. Really, Mark, you own Amazing Fantasy 15, but really, you owned me with that purchase. So, for me, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the 8th episode of Season 6 of The Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe.
If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app.
This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and keep our podcast going, go to amazingspidertalk.com. There's a big button that says Patreon. Click on it. It'll take you right on over to our Patreon. That's amazingspidertalk.com.
Yeah, Dan, and every episode of the season features artwork by comic artist Nick Cagnetti, and that, too, is available to our Patreon members. It is unlettered and in stunning high resolution.
In this season of The Amazing Spider Talk, we're going back to the mid-'80s when the Amazing Spider-Man title was handed over to one of the most legendary creative pairings in comics, who were only just starting their creative partnership. That's Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz. It was a time of immense change in the comics industry, but together Tom and Ron returned Spider-Man to its Ditko-inspired roots to create one of the most beloved runs on the title.
But don't be mistaken, because on this episode, we're actually going to be talking about more Spider-Man stories by Roger Stern. Wait, what? Have we gone back a season? No. We're going to be talking about Spider-Man's time joining up with the Avengers during Roger Stern's run on that title, and again, asking the question, is it time for Spider-Man to join the Avengers? You know, that old chestnut, Dan.
That's right, Mark. And if you'd like to follow along with our discussion, we'll be talking about 2 issues of Avengers in particular, specifically issues number 236 and 237. I think it's fair to say that these 2 issues can be read without any knowledge of Roger Stern's longer Avengers run, especially if you've seen the movies. And they can be kind of read as a sort of like part of the end of Stern's Spider-Man run. In the past, we've also talked about previous attempts by Spider-Man to join the Avengers, particularly during our first season of the show. But you should expect us to mention Avengers number 11, where Spider-Man shows up and saves the Avengers from an evil Spider-Man robot, and Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 3, Spider-Man's first proper tryout for the Avengers. But Mark, we're talking about Roger Stern's Avengers numbers 236 and 237. Tell us a little bit about these 2 comics and what makes them special.
Sure thing, Dan. Well, it's worth noting, I mean, you know, in the timeline of Marvel, that technically these 2 comics came out at the very tails end of Roger Stern's tenure on Amazing Spider-Man. It was July 1983, give or take. So that's about 6 months before the DeFalco Frenz run kicked off. So, you know, just in case you, no prize folks out there want to kind of bust on us for literally going back in time, I guess, on our show. But I mean, you know, Stern was winding down. You know, he was doing weird stuff with the Hobgoblin at this point and Wilson Fisk. So whatever. He was trying to put a cap on things, and then he would end up going on to basically really focus his attentions on the Avengers. Stern ended up leaving Amazing Spider-Man a few months after this because he had quote unquote editorial differences with Danny Fingeroth. Funnily enough, when Stern was on the Avengers, he continued on that book until about 1987. And then he had editorial differences with Mark Gruenwald, and Gruenwald actually fired Stern and he went to DC and started writing Superman. So, oops. We love you, Raj. Most fans feel like Stern's Avengers actually really started to take shape around 1985 when it was his sole focus, because he was kind of working on both ASM and Avengers at the same time. Just a shout out to Avengers Under Siege from mid 1986. That's more or less considered Stern's like magnum opus on the title. Probably the best Avenger story of the Bronze Age. It's basically the Masters of Evil take over Avengers Mansion, and they torment poor Jarvis. And I mean, what is more sinister than that? They like torture Jarvis. They rip up like Captain America's like childhood photos. I mean, it's really like wow, like they're the Zemo, Baron Zemo and the Masters of Evil really taking it to the Avengers. Anyway, as Dan mentioned in our intro, of course, Spider-Man has been featured as Avengers Curious as early as Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 3 and Avengers number 11. They reached out to him, but then he ultimately turns them down for membership because he's a loner, can't do things with other people. But then in terms of this story itself, the seeds were planted a couple of years earlier in Avengers 221, which was written by Jim Shooter, our good friend David Michelinie, and artist Bob Hall. And once I'm trying to describe the cover. It's pick 2, and it's got a bunch of headshots of different heroes, and the Avengers are restocking their ranks because they've had some Avengers kind of go off and do other things. And at one point, Thor invites Spider-Man to the team. Spider-Man doesn't say no, but he doesn't say yes. And then they end up giving spots back to Hawkeye, yawn, and then the new It thing, She-Hulk. So it's worth noting when Spider-Man references Thor's invitation in Avengers 236 here, that's where it all comes from. So that's kind of the setup here. Do you want to start getting into the story itself, Dan, or your thoughts, or do you want to touch on anything in my preamble here? Go for it.
Sure. Well, I mean, I will say, getting into the story itself, what I appreciate about the story is how like kind of new reader friendly it is. I mean, there's a couple of lingering plot threads specifically around like Star Fox and his inclusion to the team, but it's mostly something you can just kind of jump right into, which I don't think is true of a lot of Avengers comics of this era and shortly after this era, where they get mired in their own kind of crazy continuity that I think even the movies don't necessarily dare touch. Maybe we're headed in that direction, but I'll say for myself, like I read these issues for the first time a number of years ago, I think in prep for our Stern season, and lay whatever blame you want on us for not covering this during that season, but this seems as good a place as any to talk about it. And that season was pretty jam-packed as it was. But I appreciate it because I've tried to get into the Avengers many times over the years and just find a lot of its lore almost like proto X-Men in terms of like, confusing. And I just had fun jumping in this, and it could just be that Spider-Man is my entry point. And if that's something you want to use to get on board, then like, so be it. Like I'm hoping to use this with, as a springboard for myself to get back into the Avengers, if my Spider-Man reading schedule ever clears up.
There you go.
But I mean, these do feel like straight out of the Stern run. Like this could just be a side story from that title.
Yeah, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but doesn't even like the omnibus for Stern's ASM contain these issues, or are there collection? I feel like I've seen these issues part of Roger Stern's Spider-Man collections because they really do feel just naturally a part of his ASM run.
I feel I'm trying to remember. It's something like that. Like either they're included in the Amazing Spider-Man omnibus or they're not included in the Avengers omnibus for whatever reason. I remember there being something funky about how these are collected, these particular issues.
Yeah, and I'll just add not to push back, but just I've read a lot of Avengers from this era and prior, and I definitely agree with you. I don't necessarily find it as challenging to keep up as say like X-Men. Like I mean,
Sure.
I am challenged to find an entry point into X-Men once you kind of get past like Byrne and Claremont and that run there. It's just like, okay, I mean, like these Romita issues look cool, but I have no idea what's going on. Yeah, so but it is amazing to me going back and rereading these stories, um, just how like kind of not part of Avengers they feel. You know what I mean? I almost wondered, did Stern mean to include this in ASM and they said no? Or I mean, like you said, outside of like the Star Fox kind of stuff that they were referencing early on, which is out there and weird. I mean, Star Fox, for the uninitiated, he's what, the is he the full brother of Thanos or the half brother of Thanos? I mean,
I think
it's a
he's the full
weird.
brother, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, get your cosmicology degree in Thanos lineage. But yeah, I mean, and his superpower is like seducing people, which is like but he's gonna be played by what's his face in the MCU, right?
Harry
The new,
Styles.
yeah, that's I who.
If we
My,
ever if we ever see that plot line ever revisited in the
yeah,
future, who's to say at
right,
this point?
true. I mean, I think we'll
I
see.
don't know if I would go that far that I feel like you could slap Amazing Spider-Man on this and get away with it, but it is very Spider-Man centric,
Yeah.
and there's a number of like big moments for Spidey throughout these things. So suffice to say, like, let's get into the issues themselves. Roger Stern obviously writing these, Al Milgrom on art, which again, just a classic a Marvel artist, but like he gets Spider-Man straight away. Like, this is the guy you've been reading in Amazing Spider-Man. He bounces around the page. He's got that kind of cocky, attitude about him. I think the most like iconic image to come out of this is probably the opening splash of 236 of the Avengers see something is blowing up. Someone's broken into the mansion and they all run into the dining room and there's Spider-Man in a web hammock slung over all casual, like who are you expecting? It's
Right.
me, Spider-Man. And it's a really funny page.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of texts I noticed on recent reread of this. I was like, wow, like Stern is like really just like writing. It's like, I want to be an Avenger. It's like, oh my goodness, like I feel like use a pen, Sideshow Bob. I mean, like it's just like so much text. Anyway, um,
Well, but that's the key thing
yeah,
to say is the title of this issue is I Want to Be an Avenger, which is like in giant, bold cartoon lettering. And,
right,
we come to find out Spider-Man is looking for some money. He's got to pay off his grad school loans and Aunt May is dead and yada, yada,
yeah.
yada. And he's expecting to get a whopping $1,000 a week from his Avengers pay. I mean, what are you going to do? The mid 80s,
I mean,
money travel
I mean
further.
that's I would say that's big money for the '80s. Like for a superhero of Spider-Man's ilk, for sure. I mean, and yeah, you referenced the problems. I also like that it threw a little nod into the whole Black Cat being in the hospital thing from Doc Ock in the Owl Octopus Wars. So again, okay. I mean, I won't concede. Um, what I said earlier, like, oh, this was just a Spider-Man comic. They made an Avengers comic. No, it is an Avengers comic, but like Stern is like really putting the work in. I think far more like not to jump around in conversation here, but like I don't think today you would see this much work of trying to tie in Spider-Man's continuity if he was guest starred in another character's book. Like, I don't know. Like,
Do you really want me to comment on that? Because, like, yeah, I mean, like, that is true of the Marvel offices, but I don't know that it's an indication of any particular title's strengths or weaknesses. The Marvel universe just doesn't feel this coherent, or
no.
tied
I
together
agree,
anymore.
but
Yeah.
like, that's a great point. I mean, it's indicative. It's not just a Spider-Man issue. It's a Marvel issue. But like, I mean, what a time for like to pick up a book, to see like on the newsstand, like, oh, Avengers, oh, Spider-Man's in it. Maybe I'll check it out and like feel very at home reading it versus like now where it's like, like I don't know. I have to imagine if Spider-Man showed up in a comic like the same month that Miss Marvel died, it was probably like not a mention, like who
Yeah.
cares, like it just felt very like very very grounded in the ASM and spectacular storylines going on, and like you said, it just leads to that both the entry point value to it, but also the standalone value of it. Like you really can just read these issues and be done with it.
I do think it's like kind of perfect timing too. Like, cause like just a few months later we would get Secret Wars, and like, it's like, oh, okay. Like Spider-Man and the Avengers are familiar with each other within recent, although I guess most of these people on the Avengers roster didn't get, sent off to Battle World.
Yeah, yeah. Star Fox didn't make the cut, or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Maybe
uh,
Star Wolf got there. No, a
ooh.
bad 64 joke.
um, but then, so in terms of what kind of drives the action here, like you said, Peter wants his money. As he's there, there's an emergency, and the Avengers go to take off to go deal with a mission with the Lava Men. Um, you know, I will say, like, I was kind of like, who are these guys? Whatever. And Spidey, he stows away on the Quinjet and flies up with them. And then now here is something I will make a note about. It's not in our notes here, Dan, but I'm gonna surprise you with a talking point here. Um, this whole thing with like Spider-Man stowing on the Quinjet, kind of like forcing himself upon the team, kind of it actually felt very Ditko-ish to me in terms
Yes.
of like I'm thinking back to like whenever Spider-Man would just kind of like I always feel like when Spider-Man in the Silver Age was around other heroes like the Fantastic Four, his like his jerk meter was like up to like 100. You know what I mean? Like, because like it's a punk move to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, what's
absolutely.
he doing here? Like it's like I want to be on the team. All right, well, we got to do some stuff. So I don't know. Like I did find that to be an interesting choice from Stern, that like he chose to kind of elevate Spider-Man's kind of unlikability here. Do you have any thoughts on that whole
You say
development?
unlikability. I think about like youth, because that's
Mm,
kind of like the classic like thing you'd see in a movie where like the older hero is like, you can't come, you're too young, this is too dangerous, and then the kid hides away aboard whatever vehicle and pops out at the exact inopportune moment and is like, I decided to hang along, and
mm.
that's kind of exactly what you get here, which is again to emphasize, I think, that Spider-Man is like a good deal younger than the other characters on the team, and I don't know, that's the trope that I'm reminded of when I saw that in the story here.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, youth is a good is a good word for it, because like that's the other thing that really comes through here. And again, not to sound like I'm waffling on my own opinion here, but like I also feel like at the same time, like the Avengers are really depicted as being kind of like, I mean, they're the old farts. They're the ones not gonna let Kevin Bacon dance at the school. You know what I mean? Like they're just like, no, we don't like any of this Spider-Man. We don't want you being sarcastic. I mean, Captain America's freaking out when Spider-Man's like instigating the lava men, like everything, like the Avengers just feel like so old and out of touch and kind of grumpy through this whole thing. And I guess like, it elevates the humor of it. But like I was kind of like, they are still the heroes of this book here, and you're kind of rooting against them too, because they're just being such cranks about the whole thing.
Oh, I mean, they are so deeply uncool in the
Yeah.
shadow of Spider-Man. Like, it's amazing how like one guy can just show up and just make everybody else feel so conservative and old and boring. Like, I don't want to read about any of these characters.
Right.
They're like wagging their finger at Spider-Man, like, oh, we don't solve crimes like that. Or like, there can only be 6 members on our Avengers team. Like, who cares? What rule book are you following? It's so lame, and like really, like, I mean, it's one of the reasons I've not really gotten into Avengers, because like even if you go back and read, at the same time that Steve Dick or Steve not Steve Dicko, Stan Lee is writing, Amazing Spider-Man and the Avengers. The Avengers feels like so old school and boring, like, which is to say Spider-Man's just so ahead of its time. They just, and maybe it's just like they feel like DC characters, and then the real Marvel character showed up and is like the real fun part of the party.
Yeah, I could see that, but like you still had someone like She-Hulk who was, relatively. I mean, okay, it's pre John Byrne She-Hulk, which is I think what really started to kind of break the fourth wall and really
she's
play.
Mostly just played up here for sex appeal, right?
Yeah,
like she's like running around in a bath towel and
Right. But I was going to say, like, the character I think would go on to be more fun in the context of the Avengers, but still not there yet. I guess that's part of it too. It's like a lot of what's being introduced here, it just hasn't made its way through the comic stream yet in any way. But yeah, man, like I'm just like I said, yeah. I mean, saying that they're wagging their fingers, tisking. I still liked my Kevin Bacon Footloose reference. I mean, like it's everything about this is like they like put a couple of like collars on them. Like they're a bunch of preachers. Like every metaphor you can come up with here. It's just
sorry, Mark. I'm not Gen X. I don't understand what Kevin Bacon. Who is that?
Well, I didn't know who Harry Styles was earlier, so I mean, I guess we're even. Kevin Bacon was Harry Styles. No, not at all. Anyway, anything else from the first part of this comic this two-parter that you wanted to note in terms of just observations or what have you?
Well, I mean, I like these comics. I do think that the main plot is very forgettable. Like, I don't think anybody's writing home about the Lava Men, and it boils down to a lot of just kind of like generic superhero, punchy world, save the world kind of stuff. It's Spider-Man that really is the kind of spice here. And like, I mean, again, I think these are like solidly written comics. I would read almost any Stern Amazing Spider-Man comic over this. I just think the vibe on that book is more fun than this. And Spider-Man gets belittled himself, even though he's cooler than the Avengers. I think we can disagree. We're a Spider-Man show, but clearly we're unbiased about this. They like still treat him like, oh, hey, you're going to be a trainee, and Spider-Man knows well enough at the time, like that he's got enough, like, history in the game. I like that he calls them out. He's like, hey, I was like saving the city before you guys even created the Avengers. And it's like, yeah, right. You tell them, Spider-Man, like, you might've been 15, but like you could, you're still, you've been around long enough. And he at least has some wherewithal to be like, you don't get to treat me like that.
Yep. So talking about the second issue a little bit, what I found to be funny, and we should have the Heinz brothers on to analyze this, but in the second issue of this story, we get some more villains introduced. It's this new quartet of supervillains, kind of an impromptu what do you call it? Spontaneous team, if you will. But two of the four members, it's Electro and Rhino, who are Spider-Man villains, and also Blackout and Moonstone. But Rhino and Electro, those are Spider-Man villains that Stern is using in an Avengers book with Spider-Man. So I mean, is it other people's villains, his own? I mean, what is happening here, Dan? Because wasn't Roger Stern notorious for using other people's villains?
More Ditko villains have showed up in his Avengers run than in his Spider-Man run.
I mean, like for real. I mean, and again, I don't know if like using these villains here. I mean, there is an element of Spider-Man being like, I know these guys, but like, I don't know. Like like you said, it doesn't necessarily add anything to the punchy, reaction.
Yeah.
Gotta save the day kind of elements here. Like there's no, like, it's not like, oh, Electro is just like totally frying out everybody, but Spider-Man has the secret sauce to Electro. I mean, we don't really get that sense, do you?
The funniest part about it is that Electro and Blackout have like almost identical costumes. Right. It's just Blackout has like one lightning bolt on his face, whereas Electro has like 6. or 5 or whatever. I think it's 5.
Yeah.
And I find that funny. Like, do they have like some kind of like dick measuring contest? Like, I've got 5 lightning bolts. You've only got 1.
Well, it's clearly the number of lightning bolts in your cowl have affect your voltage. I don't know. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
like
It's
it's not
not
a,
what you do with your lightning bolt. It's how you, or it's not how
how
big
you
it is. It's
use
how you use
it.
it. Yeah.
Use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
the
I mean,
quantity; it's the quality. I don't know. We could do this all day, Dan.
if there was a character to do that in front of Moonstone being here, I mean, like
Yeah.
she's like, well, given like Bendis's depiction of her, she like
Right.
slept with just about every other villain, under the cowl. But
I
yeah,
mean,
I mean, I mean, it's an upgrade from the Lava Men.
yeah,
Like
for
I'll
sure.
say that. Yeah.
I was gonna make a joke with Moonstone, like get her bedpost next to like She-Hulk's bedpost, right? I mean, it's just like let's see
Oh
who's got
yeah.
more notches. I don't know. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Edit it out.
Oh
Edit it out. It's I don't
no, no, we'll leave it in. Leave it in.
know.
Live with that one, Mark.
There we go. Oh God, this is gonna be like the baby joke. Um,
Oh
anyway,
God, not the baby joke.
so moving on to Avengers fun here. Yeah, so it's not it's a welcome change from the Lava Men for sure, but again, like it's just driving action and all of this is to demonstrate once again just the difference in the personalities of Spider-Man and this Avengers team. They save the day, and it's like you kind of get the sense by the end of the story that Spider-Man is like not even interested in doing this anymore anyway, because it's just like like I mean I would be uninterested if I was Spider-Man and the way I was getting treated this entire two-parter. Like, why do I want to hang out with these guys? They suck. I mean, like what is happening here? But then the punchline, of course, is that they're like, well, we'll make you a trainee, and he's like, what trainee for what? Like what? Like I'm a superhero. But then it's like the government calls, and they're just like, you're even considering Spider-Man? No, absolutely not. Under no circumstances can Spider-Man be an Avenger. And of course, Spider-Man points out the fact that, so wait, you trust an alien Star Fox who would turn out to be a poor choice on their part over me? I mean, it's so absurd, and like
It does feel like the government is really just a stand-in for Marvel editorial, like piping in and going, you can't do this, Roger Stern. You don't
yeah,
get to have your fun toy on the Avengers. And, because like I would love to ask Roger if that was something he wanted to do, because it does feel like he's like, I can't get away with it, but I'm going to have my cake and eat it too.
yeah,
By putting them on here. I did want to note, like, there's a great moment in the second issue where I forget if it's like a bomb that's about to blow up or whatever, but Spider-Man has to deactivate this thing using his brain, and there's this great full page of like him, like maneuvering all these dials and using his brain to like figure it out, with this great final panel of him like throwing these levers forward in really dramatic fashion. And I think it's a great page to showcase that Spider-Man is not just, punchy or
yeah,
jokey. There's an intellect there, which is, I think, kind of lacking on this Avengers lineup.
yeah,
And I think that was really cool for him to do that. And it reminds me a lot of like the first issue of Big Time by Dan Slott,
mm,
where the Avengers and Spider-Man team up to take down a threat. And it's only by thinking creatively that Spider-Man is able to solve it and like prove his worth amongst the big thinkers in the Marvel universe. And this moment echoed of that, like, I mean, it preceded it by many years, but like, I thought it was cool that Stern was able to showcase many aspects of the character within this two issue story.
yeah, and that I do appreciate that too. I'm glad you brought that scene up, because like that's kind of another one of my old man cranky sticking points about how Spider-Man is often depicted today in other comics, which is I actually found this most I don't want to say offensive, but annoying during Hickman's FF run, where it's like I feel like Spider-Man's intellect is just rarely pointed out and leveraged in any kind of way in these comics. It's I feel like a lot of creators, when they're integrating Spider-Man into whether it's the Avengers or the Fantastic Four or other big event books, it's like, oh, we need another jokester, so let's write some Deadpool-esque jokes for him, or like we need another youthful energy like Johnny Storm or something. But like, I
or he's only here for the money, right? Like that
yeah,
was a big part of Hickman's Avengers run, is like,
yes,
Spidey's there because we have cash,
right, which is just frustrating because, yeah, I mean, obviously we're biased, we're a Spider-Man podcast, but like, in addition to his powers and abilities, I mean, like, he's a smart guy, and that's, he's not Reed Richards smart, but he's a smart guy, and he's probably smarter than your average superhero in terms of, and how they're certainly of this cast. So I'm glad that Stern used that to kind of highlight that here. And it's both his intellect, but also like his spontaneity and adaptability. I mean, like, those are always, I think, strong suits for Spider-Man. You could talk about it, his spontaneity being impulsive, but and we do get that side of him here in this two-parter. But like that scene certainly kind of showed the other end of it, that he can kind of think quick on his feet and do something spectacular to save the day.
Yeah, and I do want to say, to Hickman's credit, he does show up in this issue looking for money. So
yes,
it's not entirely out of character,
Right. Well, the very first issue of Spider-Man, right? He wants to be on the Fantastic Four to earn a stipend, and they're like, "Oh, we're we're a not-for-profit, bud." So it does come from somewhere, but yeah, it's just good to kind of see that. Why don't we take a quick little interlude over to the Slack, if you don't mind?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you could jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and more. Dan, before you tell me what's been happening in the Slack this week, I just want to say that I got a new phone last week, and I was having the hardest time getting back into Slack just because of my settings on my phone. So, I know. What's the difference, Mark? You're never on the Slack anyway. But no, I was trying to get on the Slack and couldn't initially. So my absence was unintentional this time. So anyway, with that said,
we missed you extra hard, Mark.
Oh, I'm sure you did. I'm sure you did.
Absolutely.
I was like, when I finally got in, I was like responding to things from like Wednesday, because I was like, oh, I would have talked about that, but whatever. Anyway, so what else is happening in the Slack this week, Dan?
Yeah, well, the funny thing is, you must have been missing from a lot of things, because you texted me the day after the announcement of the new comic, Spectacular Spider-Man. Like, can you believe it? And I was like, yeah, I could believe it 24 hours ago. Yeah, the Slack, we've been all very excited about the announcement this week of Spectacular Spider-Man, which came at a time to make me look pretty cool, because I sent out a random tweet, thread, whatever you want to call it. I'm now really officially off Twitter after Elon Musk's anti-Semitic comments. But anyway, I had tweeted or X'd or whatever, or skeeted if you're on Blue Sky, or what is it, tooted if you're on Mastodon. Anyway, about like why is Marvel like going out of their way to not release a Spider-Man book, It just makes too much sense. And the fact that they like very rarely allow Miles and Peter to cross over into each other's titles, like I can count on my fingers how many stories have included Peter and Miles together. And I just was like, this is such a no-brainer, like, direction to take. Like, any writer should go in and pitch for Amazing Spider-Man and say, I want to do Amazing Spider-Man about Peter and a mentor role to Miles. Like, it just writes itself. It's so obvious. And we see it in the movies. We see it in the video games. It's like, where is this book? Was my post. And then what, 4 days later, 3 days later, it was like,
Here's
here
the
it
book.
is. Yeah. And a lot of people remembered my, the tweet got a lot of attention, remembered my tweet and responded to me like, I thought of you immediately when I saw this. It seemed like they were joking, like, oh, Marvel threw a solicit together just to respond to your tweet. And it's like, no, they've been working on this for months. But I obviously had no idea. Like, if you're one of those people that's like, oh, Dan probably knew and was just saying that so he would look smart. I had no idea. So
Dude, are people saying that? Because that's
yeah,
insane.
I saw it online. Yeah.
Oh my God. We do not have.
Yeah,
Maybe you have access to the web of life and you're going to be in the new
that's
Man
it.
of Web movie.
Yeah, I have no inside knowledge of the comics more than like anybody listening to this show, save for one or two things that Mark and I can't talk about. But
Right.
yeah. So anyway, Mark, what was your reaction to? I mean, obviously, I was thrilled about this. I think it's a cool creative team, and between like Weissman, who did the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon show.
Yeah.
I don't know how into comics he is, but like, dude's clearly got a handle on Spider-Man, and Ramos, who could draw, like I said, a bar of soap, and I think it would be amazing. What do you think about this announcement?
Well, I mean, just to add to what you just said there, I mean, Weissman's not only does he have a handle on Spider-Man, but he's got a handle on Young Spider-Man. So, like, I'd be very curious to kind of see like the mentorship between him and Miles there. Now, I think this is great. I mean, like, I am one of the people who gave your initial tweet attention because when I saw it, I was like, yeah, why isn't that? Now, I don't have a PlayStation 5 or 4 or 3, or I mean, I got rid of my 2 years ago. Point being is I don't have the Sony games. So all my pop culture register is, of course, the Into the Spider-Verse movies and that franchise. But even regardless of that, like, for one, I love, we talked about this in our Web of episode last time out. I love the concept of a Spider-Man team book. I think, and we're gonna talk about it in our next segment too, about Spider-Man on teams. But the thing is, like, I think in the context of like a guest star or even just a consistent partnership, I think Spider-Man works really well there. Even like, I didn't love how Spider-Man Deadpool kind of devolved into something towards the end, having to do with one more day, allegedly. But like, I still enjoyed that book generally in the beginning. So I was very excited to hear about this. I think there's a lot of potential to unlock here. And even if Marvel doesn't end up going like full send in terms of analyzing that relationship and exploring it, like, again, like, it's just I love team up books. I think this is going to be a lot of fun either way. Love Ramos's art, so I'm very excited for this book. Like, this is a very enthusiastic day one buy for me.
It just seems increasingly silly that this book didn't exist. You've got like Peter hanging out with Spider Boy in the pages of like Superior Spider-Man right now, and it's
Right.
like, why is he never mentored Miles in the comics?
Right. Right.
And then like, and every problem that Miles gets in with Carnage or the Hobgoblin, it's like, where is Peter in all of this? It makes Peter seem deeply irresponsible. And it, again, we'll have this conversation, I'm sure, many more times as our show goes into the future. This idea of arresting Peter's youth and making him young makes zero sense as you continue to build out the world of Spider-Man and give all of Peter's supporting cast superpowers. And like, you can't avoid responsibility with the Spider-Man character. And, like, the more you do avoid it, the more you make him seem irresponsible. And then you're really like not living up to the brand of Spider-Man. So Mark and I are going to have more to say on this, I'm sure. We're writing a Substack piece about it. So plug for our Substack. But this is all to say, these kind of conversations are breaking out in the Slack and being done so respectfully. And look, if you're one of these people like me that is getting off of these like really ugly social media platforms, the Slack remains completely non-toxic and lovely. So come join in the fun. Hopefully Mark will get his phone figured out, like the old boomer that he is, and he'll come back to the Slack. There's a link in the description to this episode. It'll let you sign up in less than a minute and come join our web of life and destiny.
Ouch, called me boomer. All right. Well, Dan, now that we're back here, let's talk about Spider-Man the Avenger. I mean, obviously, the storyline is I want to be an Avenger. It ends with him not getting on the Avengers. Um, they certainly took you on some semblance of a journey to get to that conclusion. Um, you know, I feel like when we backtrack to those Silver Age stories of like ASM Annual 3 and Avengers 11, it's um, the depiction is more that like Spider-Man can't be on a team because he's kind of this lone wolf, this outcast. He doesn't get along with anyone. It's just not in his DNA to do it. And I think in the Silver Age context, that kind of works. Obviously, by this point in 1983, Marvel Team Up had been running for quite some time. Um, you know, we're a few months out from Spider-Man showing up in Secret Wars and fighting on, the good guy team, for lack of a better phrase. Was there anything about this story and this time and this context that you think kind of changes the general feel of, does he belong in this context? Does he? Yeah, I don't know. It certainly feels a lot different than it did in the Silver Age, but I don't know if this story. Yeah, I think the story kind of presents a whole other slate of issues of why Spider-Man doesn't work as an Avenger. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, I think even just months after this, you'd see Spider-Man joining the good guy team, so to speak, in Secret Wars, and like beating up the X-Men. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like he's not really a good team player. I think, the difference between here and the 60s is Spider-Man is like begun to punch in a bigger weight class than he did in the 60s. Like in Roger Stern's books, he's taking on like Thunderball and Juggernaut and like Avengers villains,
Mm-hmm.
all the various ghosts of apes and things like that.
I mean,
It's not,
he
it's,
did take out Thanos a few years earlier in that classic,
yeah,
storyline that you
of
can't live
course.
without.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Was it 2-in-1 annual number 2?
Yeah, and then the first part of that was in an Avengers annual, Dan. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. So, I do think there's a, like in the mid 80s, there is a good case to be made of like Spider-Man is like basically getting to the age of the Avengers in their founding, era. And like, honestly, I think, when he tried out in the 60s, he kind of like didn't get on the team due to a technicality and also kind of like a moral statement, right? He found out the truth about the Hulk in a way that
Yeah,
the Avengers weren't willing to recognize. And
yeah,
that like kind of made him question his, you know, moral values about whether or not the team was right for him. And in Avengers 11, he proves his worth by saving the Avengers. And, here too, it seems like they're willing to accept him, but then the government's like, oh, in the same way that he can't make money as Spider-Man because, you can't write Spider-Man on a check and cash it. It's like, we don't know who this guy is, so therefore he shouldn't be on the Avengers team. And, and it's kind of a prelude to where we get to eventually, which is it truly does take Spider-Man unmasking and revealing more about himself to be accepted by that community in some regard.
yeah. Um, I mean, what do you think about this concept that comes up a lot in this story and obviously previous stories, that Spider-Man can't work well with others? Like, I don't know. Like, I struggle with that because I feel like that's a convenient plot point that's brought up to kind of tell, not show. Because I do feel like like inherent to the character, like you said, is responsibility. Like if he needs to cooperate, he's gonna cooperate. I don't know. Like I sometimes have a hard time reconciling that when storylines make such a plot point out of it. Like, oh, he's just not going to listen and follow. I mean, that was the whole thing of why you're only going to be in training, because you just don't follow orders. And it's like, Says who? I don't know. Like I find that kind of silly.
Aren't they aware of Marvel's publishing schedule? There's a whole Marvel team up book starring Spider-Man in it.
I know,
Like,
right?
clearly he can do it. Although I guess most of those stories start with him like a misunderstanding between him
Oh, for
and,
sure.
so maybe word got around. This guy is like, bad on first impressions. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem like they're protesting a bit much. It's like
Yeah.
no, we really need to make a point about why this isn't working, when like
Yeah.
anybody else doing those actions, they would be like, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, I can see you making a point out of the fact that he's too impulsive, he's too sarcastic, the personality is great. I mean, I do feel like out of all of the things that I shockingly kind of like about his characterization in the context of other Marvel heroes now is the fact that he's just kind of annoying sometimes. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like that works. Like I feel like the movies with Tom Holland did that really well with the others, where he just kind of annoys people because he just runs his mouth and doesn't understand. Maybe he has some poor socialization skills or something. You know what I mean? Like, so that makes sense to me. But like, I don't know. I I have a hard time feeling like thinking, and obviously these are all fictional characters and they can do whatever the creators make them do. But like I just have a hard time thinking like if the chips are down and, Spider-Man had to kind of, fall in line that he wouldn't, you know what I mean? Like what is he going to say? No, Captain America, take his shield and smash him in the head with it and then like get evaporated by Doctor Doom. I don't know. Like I just don't see that happening. So
We're going to definitely talk about the new Avengers as we progress into the aughts with this series of seasons that you and I are doing. And we can talk about it then. But like Bendis really leans into the annoying Spider-Man thing,
mhm.
and I find it very funny. But I do think there is a lot of like room to explore there that has yet to be explored. Why is Peter not why does Peter not display this kind of behavior? Like I
Mm,
get that he, like, as Spider-Man with villains, he's a motor mouth, as a sort of like tactic or just even out of nerves.
right.
But like maybe there is an issue that needs to like get under why Spider-Man is so nervous around other Avengers enough to be such an annoyance, in a way that he's not as Peter Parker. But yeah, I mean, most of the time I read things like this and like it feels like there's no good reason that he couldn't be an Avenger,
Right.
other than like a misunderstanding or, his impetuousness. But even that feels like a construct. I mean, he does rush into things like fists, swinging
Right.
like without using his head very often sometimes. But I don't. I mean, look, I'll say it here and I'll repeat it in a couple seasons, which is like I think his inclusion in the new Avengers is really awesome and like a
Mm,
really fitting place for Spider-Man, especially in that status quo where the Avengers were kind of like operating out of someone's basement. Uh,
yeah.
I think Spider-Man as an Avenger is fine. It's really not one of those aspects of his character that I like cling to very like heavily, is that he shouldn't be an Avenger.
Yeah. I mean, I've probably frankly have softened on it over the years. I know I used to be a very big evangelist about no, he cannot, and I, I think it's more for me. It's more about like if you're going to use him in this context, and I kind of want to see him used right, if that makes, and I want to
Yeah.
see his abilities get played right. Like I said earlier, like why don't we explore more of his intellect and why don't we explore more of how his power set complements the other heroes, and I feel like we get that to some degree here, which actually makes the ending where it's just like no, because we said so. It just feel kind of like all right, fine, then we're gonna just keep circling this drain for a little bit. So um
I have no problem like with him being on the Avengers, but my preference is that he not be. And I've yet to see a book really like lay out a like really solid reasoning for
yeah.
why not. And that's why I thought like it was so exciting during Superior, that era, that like they could see him as a villain and really grow to distrust Spider-Man. And ultimately, really nothing was done with that.
Yeah.
But like that had a lot of rich potential to like restore Spider-Man to truly being this like untrustable
Outcast.
vigilante.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like that was a real missed opportunity to like finally put like a really solid
Hmm.
reasoning for this in place.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, that's Avengers 236 to 237. You know, it's two issues, not a ton of plot, but we wanted to talk about it. And maybe we should have talked about it last season, Dan, but we talked about it this season. So there you go.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, Mark, all good things come in time, but unfortunately, also with time means we got to say goodbye.
Yeah, well, like you said, Dan, it's that time. Time. I feel like I'm talking to Kang here. Time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning into this episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, and this podcast exists because of our listener support on Patreon. So thank you, listeners, for supporting us. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including new Amazing Spider-Man reviews the same week that they release in stores, exclusive artwork just for our patrons, and a ton of other bonuses. So a thank you again to everyone who's already supports us in the work that we do, and a special thanks to our newest contributor, Austin Kemprowski, who I believe re-upped his membership. So welcome back, Austin.
Great. Thanks, Austin. To download our earliest episodes, including interviews with legendary creators like J.M. DeMatteis, Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz, Mark Bagley, David Michelini, and more, subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Back Issues podcast on Apple Podcasts. Also, don't forget to check out our bi-weekly newsletter covering all things Spider-Man that we didn't have time to discuss on the podcast by going to amazingspider.substack.com and subscribing. I mean, hey, we kind of touched on some of that stuff today anyway, Dan,
Yeah.
but there's even more in the Substack, so go there and read it there.
Yeah, awesome. So, Mark, until both of our wives are romanced by Star Fox and his secret powers, what could they be? What's our motto?
Ooh. With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.